We're live now? Steve doesn't see it yet.
It says zero watching. One sec. It's on my phone now. You got it, Steve?
On Vimeo or on YouTube?
Okay, I'll resend the link. And on YouTube, I'll resend the links. But you're live right now, so it's.
Yeah, don't say anything. The mic's hot, so.
I love Infina. Can I say that?
That'll work for Sue.
See.
No, Vimeo is still the,
You gotta make sure you click on this is
test.
test. Yeah, I'm sending them now.
Okay,
Email them.
I'm gonna close all my browsers.
You send Steve and Sue?
See, check here. Steven's here.
Okay, new links. Okay, details, Steven.
There's two links there.
Okay, so I want YouTube.
You can try YouTube, yeah.
Let's see, okay, there we are. Okay, now, let me try,
Can you bring the volume up on your app?
yeah.
And then you talk.
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Talking, 'cause it'll take us-
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hey, well, yep. Okay, how's this sounding? How's it going?
That's ATC 101.
ATC 101. That's
The
what we're,
Vimeo's working.
that's right.
I'm
That's what we're
sorry,
here for.
The YouTube is working.
That's might be your phone, Steve. It's working on my phone and on.
Okay, all right, I trust you.
That's right. Okay, we're here for ATC 101. Everybody sit back, relax. We're going to enjoy the good
Sue
times right
says,
now.
okay, I see them both now.
Oh, okay, good.
All right, you're about maybe 15 seconds delay.
Really? Okay.
All right, you ready, David?
Yep.
All right, let's record, let's start over.
Say when.
Okay, go for it.
Roll it.
All right, welcome everybody. You saw my credentials up here. The only thing I'd change is Eastern Service Center Director, Air Traffic Manager, retired. Other than that, we'll go on to what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk, this is ATC 101, as you know. We're going to talk about the en route phase of flight, the terminal phase of flight. We're also going to talk about the flight service stations, the Air Route Traffic Control System Command Center. We just refer to that as the Command Center because it's so long. So we're going to start right off with the en route portion of flight. It's the ARTCCs, the Air Route Traffic Control Centers. Most pilots just refer to it as the center. So it is the en route phase of flight, and that means anytime they're flying basically above 10,000 feet, they're almost always going to be in the en route phase of flight. Below that, they could be in the terminal phase of flight. It's also the radar approach control services at airports that don't have an approach control, or they're too far away from a major metropolitan area, so the en route phase flight, the ARTCCs, have to provide that service down to the ground. We do non-radar domestic services, and that's time-based separation as opposed to being able to see it on a radar. And it's the oceanic non-radar services for aircraft operating outside of radar range, transversing the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean. Now in the Gulf of Mexico, we did put in a new system down there called ADS-B, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, and it allows us to see radar in the Gulf of Mexico without having actual turned radar, satellite-based surveillance system. This is what our flight progress strips look like. It gives us the aircraft call sign, the type airplane, the speed, the time over a fix, and that fix has to be along their route of flight, their altitude, their route of flight, and their transponder code. It's almost the same information as in a flight plan, but we don't have color aircraft, souls on board, or fuel on board, or anything like that. It's just the basic we need to provide air traffic services. The airspace is broken up about the same it's been for the last 45 to 50 years. You've got Atlanta Center here, Indianapolis Center, Chicago Center. This big one up here is Minneapolis Center, huge piece of airspace. And then in contrast to that, this little piece over here is New York Center. Now New York Center, besides having that domestic piece of airspace, they own all the Atlantic Ocean. Oakland Center over here, and they own all the Pacific Ocean, all the way beyond Guam. So that gives you a perspective how far out that piece of airspace goes. All non-radar for now. The airspace above 10,000 feet with some exceptions, and actually go on to say the exceptions really are 10,000 feet anymore. It used to be you could take a stroke of the pen and wipe it at 10,000 feet and say everybody below 10,000 or 10,000 feet and below, that belongs to the terminal. 11,000 feet and above belongs to the en route phase of flight. However, we changed that. We've terminalized some airspace. We've actually taken places like Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Fort Worth, Los Angeles, New York, and we raised the ceiling of the terminal's airspaces to provide more terminal services. And the big reason is we went from a 5-mile separation standard in the en route environment to a 3-mile separation standard in the terminal environment, which means you can put more airplanes in the same amount of airspace. Therefore, we call it the terminalization of airspace. The data is digitally displayed, which means I don't see a radar scope. You've seen the sweep go around on movies and stuff like that. Well, there's no sweep on any of these. It's a digital display of the radar data as the airplane moves along. Long-range radars is what we use. There's usually 10 to 13 radar sites that provide services to each one of the 20 centers. The target update for each one of those radars is 10 to 12 seconds. So in other words, that radar is turning very slow. Once time around, 10 seconds, right? The centers were built in the late 50s, early 60s. They were built in rule-off airport areas. Chicago Center, for example, is actually not in Chicago. It's out here in Aurora, Illinois. It's about 40 miles west of Chicago. Some people refer to it as Aurora Center. It's actually Chicago Center, just happens to be in Aurora, Illinois. Atlanta Center, for example, is not in Atlanta. It's in Hampton, Georgia, about 30 miles southeast of Atlanta. Cleveland Center is located in Oberlin, Ohio, which is about 30 miles west of Cleveland. Memphis Center, though, located on Memphis Airport. Same thing with Indianapolis Center. A couple differences there. So they're large buildings employing 400 employees or more. The center controllers never see the airplane which they provide the service for. So that's the en route. We'll go right into terminal. Terminal is broken up into 5 different areas. There's the air traffic control tower, the radar tower cab, the air traffic control tower and approach control. That's when they're a combined unit. And then the terminal radar approach control when it's a separate unit. And another one that I don't have the slide for is the super TRACON. And we're seeing more and more of those pop into existence. I'll talk a little bit more about those. In the terminal world, the first one we're going to talk about is the air traffic control tower. It's located on the airport today. I'll talk a little bit later about why I say today. Controllers rely on natural vision, binoculars, and in some cases bright radar scope. But their real job is to look out the windows. And they don't separate the airplanes in the sky. They separate airplanes by providing sequencing for landing departing aircraft and runway separation for arrival and departure aircraft. They're maintaining that separation by making sure the airplanes are coming into the airspace already in a line, or when they take off, they're already in a line taking off. And the way they do that is when they're talking to an airplane coming in, for example, my airplane, I may be flying in, I'll say, McCollum Tower, November 808, Mike Whiskey is 10 miles to the north, inbound for landing. And they'd say, November 808, Mike Whiskey, roger, enter a left downwind, or enter a right downwind, enter a straight in final. They're going to tell me where to enter the airspace based on where the airport is located at. And they'll do the next one, the next person that calls in, they're going to sequence them, number 2, to follow the Cherokee on wherever I'm at in the pattern. Okay. The air traffic control tower and approach control, this is when it's in addition to air traffic control tower services, they provide the approach control services. It's an up and down facilities. The controllers are trained to work both in the VFR tower and in the radar room. And they might work in the radar room for an hour or 2, take a break, go up and work in the tower cab for an hour or 2. Go take a break, go back down and work in the radar room for an hour or 2. They do up and down facility requirements. Approach control surfaces may be radar or non-radar, depending on the terrain and how far away the airplanes are from the antenna site itself. Locations are Charlotte. Now Charlotte's a pretty busy airport, but it's still an up and down facility. Wichita, Kansas, South Bend, Kansas City International. Big airports, but they're all are an up and down facility. When they start getting too busy, then we split them apart. The last one we did was Orlando. Orlando had a busy up and down facility, almost like Charlotte, but they get too many positions to maintain currency on, so we split the facility apart. Now if you work in the radar room, that's all you do is work in the radar room. If you work in the VFR tower, all you do is work in the VFR tower. Two separate facilities, two separate sets of managers, two separate sets of controllers. It's a split facility at that point in time. So the next one we'll talk about is one of those split facilities, a terminal radar approach control. It's a standalone building or can be co-located with a control tower. And they say that one because Detroit, for example, it's one building, two separate facilities. It was fairly new when they split apart. Well, they're not going to go out and build a brand new building, so they just kept operating like that. But it's got two separate sets of controllers, two separate managers, two separate sets of supervisors. They provide the radar approach control environment. The controller never sees the airplane, which they provide the service. Airspace coverage, 35 miles or greater from the antenna site. It's usually a single site antenna. Some places they might have an alternate antenna site also, but typically one single radar site. And some of the examples are Dallas, Denver, Detroit, and Pensacola are some examples of those type of buildings. They're standalone off-airport buildings. Super Tracons, brand new picture. Super Tracon, we took a picture of the San Diego Tracon, or Southern Cal Tracon. It's in San Diego. This is one where we actually combined up all the facilities along the LA Basin area down to San Diego and moved all the approach controls into one building, an office building down the street, matter of fact. You took all those approach controls and put them in one building. That's what it looked like right there. It's a standalone building, provides approach control services in high density metropolitan areas. Now we did this one intentionally out of economics to take all those approach controls, smaller approach controls, and put them in one place, have one building. But it's not the first one we did. The first one we did was actually, let me go back here, go up to my next slide. First one we actually did was one called N90, New York Tracon. Here we did it for another purpose altogether. It's because the airports at JFK, LaGuardia, Newark, Republic, White Plains are all so compact together that there was like little fights over the airspace. Airplanes moving through the airspace, going to one airport versus another. Everybody wanted to have their bite of the apple. We decided to create a common eye. One platform that overlooks all the airspace, that's responsible for all the airports. So now today at JFK, at LaGuardia, at Newark, there's not approach controls there. All the approach controls are at N90, New York Tracon, located out on Long Island. The next one we did was A80. We combined up Macon and Columbus, very small airports, into Atlanta Tracon and called it the Atlanta Large Tracon. It's located down in Peachtree City, Georgia. And the last one, C90. The thing about C90 though is it's considered a large Tracon, but we were going to combine up Moline, Rockford, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin, a few other places. But today, if you go out to Chicago Tracon, the only thing at Chicago Tracon is Chicago. Big building, not very many people. Flight service stations we'll talk about next. There's automated flight service stations within the NAS, and there's flight service stations within the NAS. Used to be 56 of these. We're down to 2. There's 13 of these only in Alaska. Now what I tell people, this is automated flight service stations. This is flight service stations that became automated. Same principle, it's just we didn't automate this till after we contracted out this. We contracted this out to Lockheed Martin years ago, today owned by Leidos, and they went from 56 flight service stations down to the 2. Flight service stations are up in Alaska. They're owned and operated by the FAA, and they provide these services. Recorded telephone face-to-face pre-flight briefings. They distribute your NOTAMs, that's notice to airmen, your pilot reports, and your airments. Airments are meteorological reports meant for smaller airplanes. They relay ATC clearances. They do weather observations broadcast. receive, process IFR, VFR flight plans, they do airport advisory services, and they initiate search and rescue. So you can see why we need these in Alaska, probably more than any place else, and that's why there's 13 of them up there. None of them have been contracted out. All right, other facilities, this is the Air Route Traffic Control System Command Center. Like I say, we refer to this just as the command center. They're the ones that flow the right number of airplanes to any given airport. Any given airport has a max limit of number of airplanes that can arrive or depart at that airport. Any more, and it jams up the airport, called gridlock. So what we do is we make sure we flow the right number of airplanes. So the command center works with the local facilities, both the TRACONs, the centers, and the towers, to make sure the right number of airplanes are being delivered. You want to balance capacity and demand, right? You want those two to be the same. If you get too much demand and you don't have the capacity, we end up holding a lot of airplanes. So we want to have those two balanced. The command center does that. They put in what's called a ground delay program. And every pilot in the NAS going to that airport would get a little ticket that would say EDCT, Estimated Departure Clearance Time. They're going to leave at a specific time to go to that airport, to arrive at that airport within a 15-minute window. And that way we flow the right number of airplanes to any given airport. And there's two of them in the NAS we do every day for. This is one I usually call in the audience. We do two places in the NAS. One, LaGuardia, because there's more airplanes scheduled in LaGuardia every day than there is arrivals that can go in there and land. So every day we put a ground delay program. There's one on the West Coast also that we do a ground delay program for. Any ideas? You should know this. San Francisco. What happens every morning in San Francisco? Fog. But we don't change schedules. The airlines keep their schedule because you never know if tomorrow there might not be fog. So when there's fog, we have to put in a ground delay program to slow the system down. Now the first thing a lot of times we do, the main reason we put in a ground delay program is for weather. But when you have a weather event, you got to stop the airplanes now. So what do? We put in a ground stop. So we put in a ground stop, and then as we work through the airplanes that are airborne, we put in that ground delay program to flow the right number of airplanes to that vicinity. Now we also do that in the air. We can do it if there's a band of thunderstorms across the Midwest, like there is right now. Matter of fact, the one up runs from Chicago down south. That's a line of thunderstorms planes can't penetrate. But there might be a hole someplace, so we put in a ground delay program for airplanes to go through those holes. Because not all airplanes can go across the NAS because of that weather. So it's called a ground delay program, but it's not for an airport, it's for airspace. Williams J. Hughes Technical Center, which is this one here, that's in Atlantic City. That's where we do a lot of our beta testing. We also have a standalone tower, a standalone approach control, and a standalone center there where we can do human-in-the-loop testing in a real active environment. And then Mike Monroe Aeronautical Center, that's in Oklahoma City. That's where we do training for air traffic controllers. I won't say that so much. I don't like to say that because it's really not training. It's more of a screen to find out if you have the knack and ability to be an air traffic controller. I could go through a whole speech on that, but we're going to skip it for the sake of time. Terminal radar equipment looks like this: 7, 8, 9, 11s, 4.5 to 6. Remember what I said about the en route was 10 to 12? In the terminal, much faster. One of the pictures I like to show is these two pictures. These are both that radar. This one just has a cone over it. The cone over it is protected from the elements. All of our long-range radars, we put these cones over because they're usually located on top of mountain peaks. They're getting snow, icing, freezing rain, all kinds of other elements, and they're much slower moving. So we put this cone over it to keep it out of the elements. All right, so that is ATC 101, so let's talk about airspace.
Okay, let's pause for a second. David, do we need to start a new stream or can we keep going?
No, keep going, we're good.
All right, so this is another 10-minute segment now.
We have 5 people viewing, 1 still watching right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Probably Sue.
Probably.
No, she's getting on the plane actually.
Okay, so there's somebody, maybe Steve Mack or.
Okay, so let's talk about the classes of airspace. I usually just start out by writing it out: Class A, Class B, Class C, Class D, Class E, and then I kind of pause here because there is no Class F airspace, and Class G. Now there is a Class F airspace, but not in the United States, only overseas, only in foreign countries. So we're only going to talk about these 5, or these 6 pieces of airspace. So let's talk about the difference also in airspace is how a controller uses the airspace versus what a pilot needs in the airspace. And I'm going to talk out of both sides. I'm going to talk about the pilot and the controller portion. So airspace requirement, Class A airspace, what I like to do is call it above 18,000 or above flight level 180. In order, as a pilot, for me to fly in that, I have to have an ATC clearance. I have to have an instrument rating, and my airplane must be instrument certified. I have to have two-way radio communications. You can't be special VFR because you have to be talking to the controllers. Now that thing. Traffic advisories, yes, because it's called positive controlled airspace. Now, here's what the controller needs to know. They get a phone call, a radio call from a pilot saying, I want to climb up to flight level 190. The controller's going to say, if they've got the space there, climb maintain flight level 190. They don't care if that pilot's got an IFR rating or if the airplane's instrument equipped. The pilot's requesting flight level 190, the controller's going to clear them up to flight level 110. And then they're going to maintain positive separation of that airplane. Okay? So that's real big difference for what the pilot needs and what the controller needs. You'll see that throughout this. Class B airspace, my acronym for this is big airspace. This is your Chicago's, your New York's, your Los Angeles's, your Atlanta's. It's a upside down wedding cake. Kind of looks like. I just draw it. The airport's down here. It looks like an upside down wedding cake. Goes up like this. And each one of these are pieces of airspace, and it tops off a certain airspace. The main reason we have Class B airspace is really to keep big airplanes in, small airplanes out. And what we want to do is maintain the airplanes coming out of flight levels down into the Class B to land at this airport. We want to keep the big airplanes in here because out here, underneath the veil, we have small airplanes flying around. We want to keep those small airplanes out there. However, if I as a pilot want to fly through this Class B airspace, I have to have two things. I have to establish radio communication with ATC, and I have to ask for a clearance to go through Class B airspace. I just can't willy-nilly go flying through the Class B airspace. I have to have a clearance. You can be a private or a student pilot. I can't imagine anybody sending a student pilot through there. Student pilot with an authorization by the flight instructor to go through there. ATC clearance, you have to have two-way radio communications. Special VFR is allowed. You have to have 3 statute miles in order to fly in there and clear clouds. You're being separated. You're being really maintained. It's almost like Class A airspace in a smaller scale. The next one's Class C airspace. One too far. Class C airspace is kind of like your wedding cake here, but it's a little smaller, and it's a little bit smaller airports than big ones. And I use the C for communications. You have to have prior two-way communications, but you don't have to have a clearance to go in there. You have to have two-way radio communications, which means if I call up this type of approach control that has Class C airspace, and they say stand by, I've established radio communication with them. I can proceed through that Class C airspace. If they say remain clear of the Class C airspace, then I can't fly into it. But you're not looking for that clearance. And again, the student pilot is the minimum requirement for that. They're going to provide IFR separation from IFR airplanes. They'll also give you VFR callouts. They're not going to provide the separation services from it. That's Class C airspace. Class D airspace is your towered airspace. If there's not an operating control tower at that airport, there is no Class D airspace. You have to have a towered airport there. And it has to be operational tower. So if it closes at 10 o'clock at night, then after 10 o'clock, the Class D airspace goes away. But it's a 5-mile circle up to 3,000 feet. Just looks like that. It's just a column of airspace. 3,000 feet, 5 miles around. That's owned and operated by the air traffic control tower when it's in function. Some airspace restrictions. VFR minimum distance from cloud, 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, 2,000 horizontal. One of the main reasons they did the 500 feet below the clouds is so people could go out there and work in the pattern when it's close to being IFR. So if it's 1,100 feet, that means it's VFR at the airport, but if they had to stay 1,000 feet below the clouds, that'd put them only 100 feet off the ground. So they raised it. You have to be 500 feet below the clouds so that you could do traffic pattern. But it's 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, 2,000 horizontal. Runway operations is the main portion of that. A student pilot certificate, 3-mile visibility is what I need to fly in there. And we call it when you're in Class D airspace, you want to find out if the airport is VFR or IFR. You call the airport, you find out from the AWOS, it has to have a 1,000-foot ceiling, 3-mile visibility. For me to fly into the airport, VFR, visual flight rules, I have to have 1,003. That's minimums. Class D, let's go to Class E. My acronym for this is everywhere. Class E is everywhere except for where you have A, B, C, D. This is everywhere. Now, for controller purposes, all they know is that a pilot calls them and talks to them, and they're operating inside this airspace. They're going to be worked, it's just controlled airspace. Not positive controlled airspace, controlled airspace. For a pilot, though, what I need is, in order to fly in this, I have to have 3-mile visibility, I have to maintain 500 feet below clouds, 2,000 foot horizontal, and 1,000 foot above clouds. I don't have to have any kind of other certifications. Now, if I'm IFR, then I can fly in the clouds as long as I get an IFR clearance and talk to ATC in Class E airspace. Class G airspace, I use ground for this because it is close to the ground. It's typically 700 and can be 1,200 feet, or it can actually be where Class E airspace is down to the ground. But for our purposes, we're going to say either 700 or 1,200 feet above the ground and goes down to the ground. It's uncontrolled airspace. Nobody owns it. It's where if I'm going from one airport to another and I don't want to talk to anybody and I'm not IFR certified, I can fly from point A to point B, low altitude, down to a mile visibility and clear of clouds. So I can fly between these buildings right through here, mile visibility, clear clouds, and be totally legal. I don't have to have an IFR clearance. I don't have to have an IFR flight plan. It's called uncontrolled airspace, Class G airspace. That is all the airspace. Any questions?
That's it? You did that in 7 minutes?
I didn't cover hardly any of it. I didn't know how fast to take it. I'll practice that one a little bit.
All right, David, that's it. Thank you. Yeah, that's it.